The morning air in northern France was thick with mist, rolling over the fields like a shroud. A group of German engineers stood at the edge of a wide canal, their breath visible in the cold. Before them rested something that seemed impossible. A Panzer III tank, sealed tight with rubber linings and strange metal pipes sprouting from its turret-like reeds, sat half submerged in the murky water. The men around it were silent. Only the ripple of the current broke the stillness. A whistle cut through the air. The tank's engine rumbled to life. Diesel smoke drifted low as the machine eased forward, treads churning softly, then vanishing beneath the surface. The snorkel pipes trembled as the water swallowed the turret. Moments later, the entire vehicle disappeared. The ripple spread outward, then faded into calm. No one spoke. They waited. A full minute passed. Then, too, somewhere beneath their boots, a 30-ton war machine crawled along the bottom of the canal, guided only by a compass and the steady hand of its driver. Finally, on the far bank, the surface broke. A column of water burst upward, followed by the steel head of the tank. The crowd erupted in disbelief. It had worked. For the first time, a German panzer had travelled underwater. The year was 1940, and Germany was preparing for something the world had never seen. Hitler's armies had crushed France in 6 weeks. Britain stood alone across the channel, defiant but exposed. To cross the narrow strip of sea that separated them, the Reich needed not just ships, but a way to deliver armour to English soil. Landing craft were too few, and the Luftwaffe had failed to break Britain's will. So the engineers of the Wehrmacht began to think the unthinkable. If tanks could not float, then they would walk along the seabed. The idea was born inside the Armoured Vehicle Research Division in Berlin. Reports of the British preparing coastal defences had reached the top brass. The invasion plan, codenamed Operation Sealion, demanded a way to get heavy armour across the channel without relying on fragile barges. Colonel Fritz Siebel and his team proposed a radical solution. Take existing Panzer III tanks, make them watertight, and drive them beneath the waves using long air tubes that reached above the surface. Most officers laughed. Some called it madness. But Hitler approved experiments anyway. He loved grand, impossible schemes, especially ones that could humiliate the British. So work began in secret. Ordinary tanks were stripped, sealed, and fitted with air hoses, cables, and waterproof hatches. The project was given a name that sounded almost mythic: Tauchpanzer, the diving tank. Only a handful of units knew about it. The soldiers assigned to test them were told nothing until the day they stood by the canal. Inside the first prototype, the crew moved with tense precision. Every seam, every joint had been covered with grease and special rubber. The hatches were locked tight. Once submerged, they would have no view of the outside world, only the faint glow of their instruments. A single failure could mean drowning in seconds. As the tank crawled along the riverbed, the driver relied on a thin periscope to glimpse the world above. The gunner and commander kept their eyes on gauges that tracked air pressure and oxygen flow. The mechanic prayed the engine's exhaust hose would stay above water. If it dipped even for a moment, the engine would suffocate. When the tank finally rose from the canal, dripping and steaming, the crowd of engineers clapped in awe. The driver emerged, soaked in sweat but grinning. "It works," he said simply. Word of the success spread quickly through the testing grounds. Soon a line of modified panzers waited for their turn to descend into the murky water. Some would fail, flooding before they reached the far side. Others would vanish into the current, never to be seen again. But enough made it through to prove the theory. For a moment, it seemed Germany had found a secret weapon. In Berlin, reports of the trials reached the Führer's desk. Hitler demanded more tests. He imagined hundreds of these underwater machines crawling beneath the English Channel, emerging on British beaches like steel monsters from the deep. He saw them crushing resistance before the Royal Navy could react. But the engineers knew the truth. Every success had come at the edge of disaster. The tanks could operate underwater, yes, but only in calm, shallow water and for short distances. The channel was unpredictable. The currents, the waves, the tides all could rip the fragile hoses from their mounts. A single storm could doom the entire force. Still, the idea persisted. It became part of a larger dream, one fueled by desperation and pride. The Reich scientists were pushing the limits of what was possible: rockets, jets, superweapons, and now, even tanks that could breathe underwater. At the canal test site, the air grew thick with the scent of diesel and mud. Another panzer rolled toward the water. Soldiers watched with a mix of awe and fear. One engineer whispered that they were seeing the future of war. Another muttered that they were tempting fate. The tank hesitated at the edge, its nose dipping into the water. The commander gave the signal. The treads groaned, then sank beneath the surface. Within seconds it was gone. Silence returned to the canal. What the men didn't know was that this strange experiment would soon become a symbol of both German ingenuity and its madness, a story buried in the mud of forgotten plans and in the dark waters where the dream of conquest drowned before it ever reached the shore. By late summer 1940, the German High Command was drunk on victory. France had fallen, the Low Countries were in ruins, and the swastika flew over nearly all of Western Europe. Only one enemy remained, the island fortress across the sea. Britain was bloodied but unbeaten, standing behind a thin blue line of ships, planes, and coastal guns. Hitler believed that if Britain could not be bombed into submission, it could be invaded. His planners began drawing maps of beaches along the southern coast, Dover, Folkestone, Hastings, and naming them landing zones. Operation Sealion was born. But the deeper they looked, the more impossible it seemed. The English Channel was narrow, yes, but treacherous. Rough tides, shifting winds, and constant patrols by the Royal Navy made a direct crossing nearly suicidal. The Kriegsmarine had no true landing craft fleet, no armada ready to storm beaches. What it did have were hundreds of river barges, slow, fragile, and never meant for open seas. They could carry infantry, maybe trucks, but not the one thing the Wehrmacht depended on for victory: tanks. Without armour, the invasion would crumble the moment British defences opened fire. That problem haunted the German engineers. They needed a way to get panzers onto British soil without risking a fleet they didn't have. Someone suggested welding tanks to pontoons. Another proposed carrying them on the decks of barges to be rolled off onto the sand. But every plan ended the same way: too heavy, too risky, too exposed. Then, one young engineer mentioned an experiment he'd read about from years before, when German scientists had tested sealed vehicles underwater for river crossings. The room fell silent. It was absurd, yes, but it sparked a question that refused to die. Could a tank, if properly sealed, simply drive along the bottom of the sea? The theory was simple enough. Water doesn't crush steel instantly, not at shallow depths. If the crew could breathe and the engine could get air, a tank could move underwater like a slow, crawling submarine. It would not need bridges, pontoons, or barges. It would simply walk across the sea floor. The more they studied it, the more it seemed possible. The engineers of the 18th Panzer Regiment were ordered to begin trials. The Panzerregiment III, a reliable medium tank with room for modification, became the test subject. It was fitted with a tall snorkel, a metal pipe that acted as both air intake and exhaust. The seams of the turret and hatches were sealed with rubber gaskets. Every crack that might leak was packed with grease and coated with bitumen. Electrical wires were wrapped in waterproof sleeves. The result was a strange-looking machine. Its turret looked like a submarine tower, its gun barrel capped tight to keep out the water. The inside smelled of oil and metal, and when the hatches closed, the crew was sealed in total isolation. They were trained to navigate by compass alone, following preset bearings across the river or lake floor. Training was brutal. Crews learned how to hold their nerves as the water rose over their vision blocks. They memorized emergency drills: how to use hand pumps if water leaked in, how to shut off the engine before it flooded, how to use a single escape hose if everything failed. There were no guarantees. During one early exercise, a test tank slipped too deep into a muddy riverbed. Its treads jammed in the silt. The crew tried to reverse, but the suction held it fast. Inside, the air grew thin. One man banged on the hatch, his voice muffled by the steel walls. It took nearly half an hour for divers to reach them. When they were pulled out, pale and trembling, they refused to go back inside. Others volunteered to take their place. Among them were veterans from the French campaign, men who had seen too much to be frightened by experiments. They joked that if the British didn't drown them, the engineers would. But the tests improved. Each time, they learned more about how the tanks behaved underwater, how the currents tugged at their treads, how the bubbles changed the balance, how even the smallest crack could turn fatal. By September 1940, nearly 200 Panzer had been converted into Tauchpanzers. Each had its own snorkel, its own sealed body, its own crew trained in underwater operations. The plan was to load them onto modified barges, tow them across the channel, then release them near the shore, where they would crawl up the seabed for several hundred meters before bursting out of the waves onto British sand. It would have been one of the most terrifying sights in modern warfare, steel monsters rising from the deep, engines roaring, water cascading off their armor as they opened fire. On paper, it could work. In the field, it was a gamble with fate. German meteorologists warned of unpredictable tides and strong cross currents. Naval officers doubted that the hoses could stay above water in rough seas. The panzer crews themselves, though obedient, whispered doubts. They had seen too many experiments end in silence. Still, Hitler demanded readiness. Every day, the beaches of northern France filled with barges, tanks, and troops waiting for the signal. Soldiers painted invasion arrows on road signs pointing toward Calais. Propaganda broadcast promised that soon the last island would fall. And among those waiting in the mist were the Tauchpanzer crew's men who had trained to fight not only the British but the sea itself. They stood beside their strange machines, staring out at the grey horizon, imagining the darkness beneath those waves. None of them knew that the invasion would never come. A shift in the air war, the stubborn resistance of the RAF, and Hitler's growing obsession with the East would soon bury Operation Sealion before it began. But the underwater tanks would not be forgotten. Their story was not over. They would resurface again years later in a very different kind of invasion, one that changed the course of the entire war. When the autumn rains came to France in late 1940, the Channel turned grey and violent. The wind howled across the cliffs of Calais, slamming against the half-finished barges gathered in secret coves. The dream of Operation Sealion began to fade like smoke in the rain. Each week brought new excuses: rough seas, RAF raids, lack of coordination, but everyone in the Wehrmacht knew the truth. The invasion was dead. The Tauchpanzers, those strange diving machines built for an impossible crossing, were quietly pulled back from the coast. They sat rusting in open fields, their snorkel pipes pointing toward the sky like grave markers. Crews who had spent months training for underwater operations were reassigned. Many felt relieved, others felt betrayed. They had risked their lives testing a weapon that would never be used. But the story of the underwater tanks did not end there. By the spring of 1941, Germany's attention had shifted eastward. The Führer's gaze turned toward the vast lands of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, was in motion. It would stretch from the Baltic to the Black Sea, involving millions of men and tens of thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. And among the long list of technical units preparing for the offensive, someone remembered the Tauchpanzers. The engineers realized that the idea of a waterproof tank could still be useful. While the English Channel had proven too wild, the rivers of Eastern Europe would soon pose a new challenge. Germany's rapid blitzkrieg tactics depended on speed. Rivers like the Bug, the Dnieper, and the Dvina could easily halt an entire armored column. Bridges could be destroyed by retreating Soviet forces, creating deadly bottlenecks. But what if tanks could simply drive beneath the rivers instead of waiting for pontoon bridges to be built? The order came quietly from Berlin: reactivate the Tauchpanzer units. Mechanics uncovered the old machines, scraped off the rust, and began repairs. The snorkel tubes were shortened to suit river crossings, and the sealing systems were reinforced. The crews were retrained to handle swift currents and muddy terrain. What had once been an ambitious invasion project now became a practical battlefield experiment. On June 22, 1941, when the German invasion of the Soviet Union began, hundreds of tanks rolled east under the rising sun. Among them were the Tauchpanzer III units of the 18th and 3rd Panzer Divisions. Their orders were clear: cross the Bug River within hours of the first artillery barrage and secure the opposite bank before Soviet defenses could regroup. That morning, near the town of Brest-Litovsk, the underwater tanks made their combat debut. The roar of artillery echoed through the forests as the panzers lined up at the water's edge. Engineers waded in first, marking the depth and ensuring that the banks were firm enough for the machines to emerge. Then the signal came. One after another, the sealed tanks rolled into the river. To the soldiers watching from shore, it looked unreal. The tanks disappeared completely, leaving only ripples and a few air hoses breaking the surface like sea serpents. Minutes later, muffled explosions sounded from across the river. The Tauchpanzers had surfaced on the far bank, firing their guns as Soviet machine gunners fled in confusion. The crossing was a success. For the first time in history, armored vehicles had attacked from beneath the river. The German engineers, who had once been mocked for their obsession with underwater tanks, now watched their designs become part of Blitzkrieg's terrifying efficiency. In the following weeks, the Tauchpanzer units helped lead several key crossings along the Dvina and Dnieper rivers. Each time, the same process repeated: seal the tanks, submerge, drive beneath the surface, and emerge firing on the opposite bank. Soviet troops who witnessed it were stunned. Some reports described ghost tanks that rose from the water without warning. But the victories came at a cost. The riverbeds of Eastern Europe were not the calm, predictable canals of France. Mud sucked at the treads, currents dragged at the hoses, and sudden floods could drown a tank in seconds. Some crews never resurfaced. Others barely escaped, gasping for air as their vehicles vanished into the murky depths. Even so, the results impressed the German command. The Tauchpanzer had proven itself as a specialized but effective tool. More units were converted and sent east. Yet the same limitations that had doomed Operation Sealion now returned. The equipment required constant maintenance, and the stress of prolonged operations led to leaks and mechanical failures. The snorkel system, so clever on paper, often clogged with mud or collapsed under pressure. By the end of 1941, the blitzkrieg slowed. The endless distances of the Soviet steppe, the fierce resistance, and the bitter cold began to consume the invaders. The underwater tanks were gradually phased out, their special gear stripped away to simplify repairs. Many were converted back into standard Panzerreserves and thrown into regular combat. Still, among the soldiers who had seen them in action, the legend of the diving tanks lingered. They told stories around campfires about the days when their machines had vanished beneath rivers and reappeared like ghosts, turning the impossible into reality. Back in Berlin, the project files were archived and forgotten. Yet within those yellowing pages lay blueprints and field notes that would one day inspire a new generation of engineers men who would design amphibious vehicles for a future world war, one where crossing water would again decide the fate of nations. The Tauchpanzer had not conquered Britain. It had not changed the course of history, but it had proved one thing beyond doubt. Even in the madness of war, imagination and desperation often share the same blueprint. By 1944, the world that had once trembled under Hitler's armies was beginning to change. The Reich that had stretched from the Atlantic to the outskirts of Moscow was shrinking under relentless pressure from both east and west. Yet deep within the war's machinery, echoes of earlier ideas still moved quietly, reshaping how men fought and how nations planned to strike. The Tauchpanzers were gone by then, most converted back into standard tanks, some lost to the rivers of Russia, others rusting where they had once emerged victorious. But their influence had not vanished. The concept of armored vehicles capable of crossing water had planted a seed. German engineers had learned lessons through bitter trial and error: how to seal engines, how to vent exhaust through snorkels, how to create pressure systems that allowed steel beasts to breathe under the surface. Those lessons did not die with the Reich. In a strange twist of history, they would resurface in the hands of the very men who sought to destroy it. Across the Channel, Allied engineers were wrestling with their own invasion nightmare. To liberate Europe, they had to land an army on heavily fortified beaches, a task as daunting as Operation Sealion had once been. The invasion was codenamed Operation Overlord, and it demanded not only courage but machines that could do the impossible. Tanks had to come ashore through surf, sand, and mud, often under enemy fire. Traditional landing craft couldn't bring them close enough without risk of sinking. Among the Allied planners, one man obsessed over this problem: Major General Percy Hobart of the British Royal Engineers. A visionary often dismissed as eccentric, Hobart believed that specialized armored vehicles could turn disaster into victory. His designs became known as Hobart's funnies, strange contraptions with names like the Crab, the Crocodile, and the Ava. And then came one that would sound familiar to anyone who had ever seen a Tauchpanzer. The DD tank, or duplex drive, was a Sherman tank wrapped in a collapsible canvas skirt that allowed it to float like a boat. Propellers driven by the tank's engine pushed it through the waves. When it reached shore, the skirt deflated and the tank rolled forward, guns blazing. It was the Allies' answer to a problem the Germans had tried to solve years before. The irony was impossible to ignore. In 1940, Germany had dreamed of sending underwater tanks to invade Britain. In 1944, Britain was preparing to send floating tanks to invade Germany's fortress Europe. History had turned itself inside out. On the morning of June 6, 1944, as the first light of dawn touched the French coast, the DD tanks of the Allied invasion began their perilous journey across the surf toward Normandy. The sea was rough, the air thick with mist and fear. Many of the crews knew their chances were slim. Some tanks sank before they ever reached the shore, swallowed by the same kind of merciless water that had nearly doomed the German experiments years before. Others pressed on, surfacing through the waves to fire at German bunkers still half shrouded in smoke. When soldiers on the beach first saw them, they couldn't believe their eyes, great steel tanks rising from the sea like monsters from myth. It was a scene that mirrored the Tauchpanzer trials in France 4 years earlier, only now the colours, the flags, and the cause had reversed. Not all of Hobart's floating Shermans survived. The currents at Omaha Beach were too strong. Many were lost with their crews, but those that made it ashore changed the fate of the invasion. Their guns silenced German defences that had pinned down the infantry. They cleared paths through mines and barbed wire. They made it possible for the men behind them to live. War had once again proven that imagination, no matter how strange or desperate, could alter the course of history. Meanwhile, in the ruins of Berlin, a few surviving German engineers watched the newsreels of the Allied landings with silent recognition. They had seen the same dream before machines defying nature itself, turning water from barrier to battlefield. They may have lost their war, but they understood, perhaps better than anyone, the price of innovation born in fear. In the months that followed D-Day, amphibious tanks became a symbol of Allied ingenuity and courage. The world called them a triumph of engineering, but in secret archives, Allied intelligence officers noted that some of the earliest concepts of sealed tanks and snorkel systems had been recovered from captured German research. Even as the Reich crumbled, its blueprints whispered into the future. By the end of the war, both sides had learned the same lesson. In modern warfare, the boundary between land and sea no longer existed. It could be crossed or crawled beneath by any nation willing to gamble everything on a machine. The Tauchpanzer was gone, buried under rivers and forgotten battlefields. But its legacy lived in every tank that rolled off a landing craft, every armored vehicle that forded a river under fire, every soldier who trusted that steel and oxygen could keep him alive under the weight of the world. It had begun as madness and ended as prophecy. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Europe was a graveyard of machines. Tanks lay half buried in fields, planes rusted on runways, and entire cities were nothing but ash and memory. But among the ruins, engineers from every nation began picking through the wreckage, searching for anything that might hold a secret. The Allies moved fast. In what became known as Operation Paperclip, American and British intelligence teams combed through German research archives, taking everything they could: rocket blueprints, jet engine prototypes, radar equipment, and more. Deep in those files were also the long-forgotten notes of the Tauchpanzer project. Schematics showed pressure valves, exhaust tubes, and sealing systems tested years before anyone else had attempted such things. It wasn't a top priority like the V-2 rockets, but it was quietly copied, studied, and filed away. While the world celebrated victory, another war was already forming a silent, ideological one: the Cold War. And in this new conflict, rivers, marshes, and coastlines once again became strategic frontiers. Both East and West realized that armored mobility across every type of terrain, even underwater, could decide the balance of power. In the Soviet Union, engineers at the Kirov factory in Leningrad studied captured German tanks in detail. They admired the simplicity of the Tauchpanzer system. Soon, the Soviets developed their own solutions. The T-54 and later T-55 main battle tanks were fitted with detachable snorkels that allowed them to cross rivers up to 5 meters deep. Crews practiced driving blind beneath the surface, guided only by compass and nerve, the same skills German panzer crews had learned in 1941. Soviet manuals even contained warnings almost identical to those found in the old German documents. If the hose collapses, shut down the engine immediately. In the West, the Americans and British followed their own path. They perfected amphibious vehicles rather than true diving tanks, but the principle was the same: make steel swim. The American M29 Weasel and later the LVTP series became icons of flexibility, designed to move seamlessly from ship to shore. The British continued refining the DD duplex drive system, creating variants that saw service into the 1950s. The dream of the Tauchpanzer had evolved. No longer a desperate gamble for invasion, it had become part of modern military doctrine. Mobility was everything. Engineers built bridges faster, pontoons lighter, and vehicles smarter. But every design carried a shadow of the original idea that a tank could survive where men were never meant to go. For the soldiers who trained with these machines, the lessons were eternal. To drive a tank underwater was to face a primal fear. Every sound was muffled, every vibration magnified. The pressure pressed against the steel like invisible hands. A mistake meant drowning inside a coffin of armor. And yet, crews still volunteered. They trusted in engineering, in discipline, and in one another. Decades later, during the Vietnam War, American and Soviet-built amphibious tanks once again crawled through rivers and swamps, their snorkels reaching toward the surface like reeds, just as those German pipes had done in that misty French canal in 1940. History, it seemed, could not resist repeating itself in steel and mud. By the 1970s, almost every major military power had some version of the technology. NATO manuals cited submersible capability as a key feature of armored vehicles. The Germans, now part of a divided nation, built the Leopard 1 with advanced fording gear that could drive several meters below water. In Moscow's parades, Soviet T-72s rolled past crowds with tall snorkel tubes folded along their turrets, a silent tribute to an idea born in a different century, under a very different flag. What had once been madness was now standard practice. And yet, behind the technical success, there lingered something more human. The men who had first tested the Tauchpanzers had not been chasing glory. Most were simple soldiers, mechanics, and engineers trying to make sense of orders that defied logic. They faced fear with the only tools they had: courage and obedience. Many didn't survive the experiments. Their names were never written in books, their stories buried with their machines under rivers whose currents still whisper their secret. In a way, they were pioneers. Not heroes in the traditional sense, but explorers of the unknown, men who stared into the water and saw not reflection, but possibility. They proved that even in a time ruled by chaos and tyranny, the human mind could still reach beyond its limits. Today, the concept lives on in peace rather than war. Amphibious rescue vehicles, underwater exploration rovers, and deep-sea engineering robots all carry echoes of those first experiments. Every machine that breathes below the surface owes something, however small, to that day in 1940 when a tank disappeared beneath a canal and rose again on the far side. The Tauchpanzer was built for conquest. It became a symbol of endurance. It failed to change the war, but it changed the way men thought about what machines could do. What began as an act of desperation ended as a lesson that still shapes technology today, that the boundary between air and water, between the possible and the impossible, is only as strong as the courage to cross it. The war ended decades ago, but sometimes when the rivers of Europe run low, something strange happens. Fishermen and hikers stumble upon the shapes of old machines buried in the mud-rusted shells, half-rotted steel, still clinging to the faint outline of a turret or a track. Most passers-by walk on, unaware that they're looking at ghosts of an impossible dream. But those who know stop and stare. Somewhere beneath those waters, the Tauchpanzer still sleeps. The documents call it a failure. The invasion it was built for never came. It didn't change the tide of war or rewrite the balance of power. But the truth is never that simple. History rarely remembers the experiments that didn't win battles, yet it is built upon them. The underwater tank was one of those rare inventions born between genius and madness, a project too daring for its time, yet too brilliant to be forgotten. Every bolt, every pipe, every seal told a story. It wasn't just a machine. It was the echo of an age when imagination was driven by fear. The men who designed it weren't thinking of glory. They were trying to solve a problem no one else had faced: how to make steel breathe. And in doing so, they created something that blurred the line between land and sea, between what could be built and what should be left to dreamers. In the years that followed, the world moved on. The oceans became highways for commerce, the skies filled with planes, and tanks rolled across deserts instead of rivers. But deep inside military manuals, diagrams of snorkel systems and watertight hulls still carried their fingerprints. Each new generation of engineers learned from their work, often without realizing it. When modern tanks today drive through flooded terrain, when rescue vehicles wade through storms, when explorers send machines beneath the ice of distant moons, they all inherit a fragment of that same defiant spirit. The courage to go where men were never meant to go. And yet, the legacy of the Tauchpanzer isn't just about machines. It's about the people who believed in them. The mechanics who sealed every hatch with trembling hands. The drivers who listened to the creak of metal as water closed over their heads. The officers who stood on the riverbank, waiting for bubbles to rise, praying the tank would surface again. Most of their names are lost. Their photos, if they existed, are yellowed and fading. But somewhere in those faces was the same determination that defines every leap of human invention, that quiet refusal to accept the limits of the world. If you stood by that canal today, where the first test took place, you'd see only reeds and calm water. The noise is gone, the diesel fumes long vanished. But under the surface, the earth still holds fragments of their work. A bolt, a tread, a whisper of steel that once defied the impossible. That's where the story of the underwater tank truly lives, not in museums or textbooks, but in the current of ideas that keeps moving forward unseen. Because in the end, the Tauchpanzer wasn't just a weapon. It was a message, a reminder that even in the darkest hours of history, human imagination doesn't stop. It dives deeper, and sometimes it resurfaces still breathing. In a quiet training ground somewhere in Eastern Europe, the sound of diesel engines echoes through the morning fog. A line of Leopard 2 tanks, sleek, modern descendants of those early steel beasts, prepares to cross a wide river. Soldiers check the tall snorkel tubes folded along the turrets, sealing the hatches just as their grandfathers once did. The commander's voice crackles over the radio. Proceed. One by one, the tanks slide into the water. The current tugs at them, the surface rippling as the massive shapes disappear beneath. For a few moments, there is only the faint hum of engines and the steady stream of air bubbles rising to the surface. Then, on the far bank, dark forms begin to rise, the first tank bursting from the water in a surge of spray, sunlight glinting off its armor. It looks almost alive, breathing. Nearby, engineers record data and watch carefully, but none of them can escape the feeling that they're witnessing a scene from history repeating itself. Different flag, different cause, same defiance of nature. And far from the battlefield, the idea continues in another form: amphibious rescue vehicles driving through flooded streets, carrying families to safety during storms. Their wheels churn through the water, their engines humming beneath the surface. In every one of them, from the Leopard to the humble rescue rover, lives a quiet inheritance from a time when men first dared to make steel swim.